Hello, everyone. Welcome to Munro Live podcast. And I'm Kevin Harty, and I'll be hosting this particular podcast. I'm a design consultant here at Munro Associates. And for those of you that are new and may not be familiar with Munro, we're an engineering consulting firm that does reverse engineering, teardown benchmarking, costing, and really we kind of blend a lot of these services together for various clients as well. So. And if you're in Michigan this fall, we'll be at the Automotive and Interiors and Advanced ADAS, Advanced Driver Assistance Systems, and Automotive and Vehicle Technology Expo. So today I'm with Alanis King. She's a contributor editor for Road and Track, a host of Donut Media's F1 podcast, co-author for Racing with Rich Energy, a Rogue sponsor, and how it took Formula One for a ride, and previously worked for Jalopnik and Business Insider. So, Alanis, thank you very much for joining us, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So,
thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So, I guess to start off, because I'm familiar with you. Tertiary, I've been pretty busy the last few years, so I don't keep up with a lot of things, like automotive media, ironically. But if you could just maybe kind of start off with maybe how you got into cars, because ironically in the industry, there's a lot of people that aren't into cars that work in it, right? So
that's so true. So I actually got into motorsports first. So in 2009, I was 13 years old. I was going to turn 14 that year. And we were mid-recession, right? Everything is bad.
Sure.
And no one has any money. So my mom got free tickets to a NASCAR race from her job. So she comes home one day and she says, I have free tickets to a NASCAR race in Dallas. And I said, that sounds horrible. Why would I want to do that? And she said, well, it's the recession and we don't have any money. So if you want to do anything interesting, we're going to go to NASCAR. And I said, that doesn't sound interesting, but I guess I'll go. I went. It was the most incredible thing I'd ever seen. The facility felt larger than life. You go up to a NASCAR track for the first time, and it is a sporting facility with a 1 to 2.5, 3 mile track on the inside of it. Like, this is not normal, right? It's huge. You get up in the stands, you can basically see the whole world from your seat. When the cars go by, there are 40 cars. They shake everything. They're so loud. It was the most incredible thing I'd ever seen. I didn't know who Dale Earnhardt Sr. was. I didn't know anything. And I just decided this is what I'm going to do with my life. I never missed another NASCAR race after that. And then I eventually got into the car industry too. So that's kind of how it happened.
Okay. I mean, I've been to a few races, like very young, a Bush with Boy Scouts, went to Bush, actually in Nazareth before they tore that track down. So it's tiny, fast, and scary and dangerous. So I think eventually people complain about the noise, even though you bought a house around a racetrack. But and
people do that all the time, and it's really unfortunate.
But that's pretty interesting. And then from the automotive media aspect, that's I would argue a very interesting landscape in general, especially I feel like over the last 5 years specifically has changed a lot. And
yes,
if you wouldn't mind kind of how you got into that.
Yeah, actually, I was in college and I went to the University of Texas, and one of my professors actually worked with Patrick George, who's the editor-in-chief of Jalopnik for a long time. And I was my second year of college. I was 19 years old, and Jalopnik needed a weekend editor. So my professor said, hey, Patrick, how about this kid who's in my class? And Patrick was like, okay. And I just started writing for Jalopnik. When I started writing for Jalopnik when I was 19, I only knew motorsports. I did not know the car industry. So I had to learn the car industry on the job. And the weekend editor was a really interesting job because you had to write everything, edit everything, publish everything on social media, do all of the moderating. It was an everything job, right? And so that was what I got thrown into, basically. I did that all throughout college. I graduated college 2 years later. So for 2.5 years, I was the weekend editor of Jalopnik. And then I went full-time at Jalopnik, and I stayed there for a couple of years before I went to Business Insider. And now I have a new job coming soon that I haven't announced yet, but it's really exciting.
Awesome. And I mean, I'm trying to think. I feel like for people in my, age group within the auto industry, kind of grew up in many ways with Jalopnik and aspects of that. I think in some regard, if there's any impact that I've had at Munro, it would be randomly running into Dave Tracy off-roading, with a mutual friend from Chrysler. And that kind of kicked off an article here, about Munro and what we did, which was interesting because I remember distinctly at the time, a lot of people thought what we were doing here was like illegal, despite the fact that, you shouldn't be allowed to do this. It seems unscrupulous. Despite the fact that, I would argue, if you are the first 20, of any vehicle that's purchased aside from internal employee, orderings and things of that nature, is just the competitors buying your product, right? And you can see them, we're across the street from Chrysler and you're look over and oh, look what they've got. And it's just sitting in lot E or whatever, and they all kind of have their whole competitive fleets, and depending on how interested they are in a vehicle, they might buy, more than one or anything like that. But everyone is doing this in some way, shape, or form. So I thought that was something that was interesting from our end. When you look, I thought the people kind of looking inside of, I guess, our corner, if you will, of the industry. But
yeah, definitely. And I mean, I worked with David for a long time, and he was wonderful, and he knows a lot about the automotive industry. And so if I ever had questions about wrenching on a car, I would ask David. If he had ever had questions about grammar or the style guide at Jalopnik, David would ask me. So we very much mutually helped each other while we were there.
Yeah. I mean, we speak often in PowerPoints and bullet points, and there's a lot of PowerPoint engineering that happens in conveying things in that format versus long format and writing.
Oh yes, and writing certainly is an interesting format. A lot of people think it's easy, and sometimes I forget how difficult it actually is because writing isn't something where you can just go on a stage and show, look at this thing I wrote. Everybody's like, okay, great, it's words. Whereas if you go on stage and sing or something, people will go, wow, you're so talented. But writing is one of those things where you have to actually remind yourself that it takes a lot of talent, because you'll see people try to do what you do and you'll go, oh yeah, it's taken me a lot of years to be able to do this. And other people do struggle with it. But on the surface, it can be hard to remember how much talent it takes.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like even with just word selection, especially the shorter the article is, maybe you have to be even more conscious. Any product we make here, when we go through a review, you kind of get hung up on, it's what do you actually mean when you say this? And you're like, well, I'm trying to say this. You're like, I don't know if you're really conveying that. Or I get it, but I don't think, the customer or the general audience, whoever might see this slide, someone in finance or something like that, will get this. Let's change it.
Fact checking is also a thing with words. So when I wrote my book with my co-author, Elizabeth Blackstock, our book is about 100,000 words. And when you write a story, you fact check it as you go, but you also do separate fact checks. So our rule was everything we write is fact checked while we write it, but then we also each fact check it separately, word by word. And so our rule was, if it's just written, it's in a black font. If it's been fact checked once, it's in purple. And if it's been fact checked twice, it's in maroon. If you change any word at all, you revert the whole sentence back to black, and it has to be redone.
Okay.
Because if you choose the wrong words, sometimes those words can have connotations that make something factually more murky than it should be, and you won't even notice it while you're writing. And so you have to go through and fix it because you don't want any legal liabilities. You also don't want to present any information that may be incorrect.
Right. I mean, I don't know anything about writing a book. I've done some white papers here. I've written some other papers for school, and even on the Army side of the house for various leadership courses, which are very different. The Army writing style is very upfront, bottom line upfront, very brief, C-spot run. So you kind of explained a little bit of it. I'm assuming it was kind of like a remote and very collaborative aspect with, like a shared document, and you kind of go through this.
That is exactly what we did. So basically, we put down the chronology of the book because our book was in chronological order, pretty much chronological order. It had the little side quest in chapter 3 where we talk about other things that are related to the topic, but it's in chronological order, basically. So we did our chronology, and then each of us claimed about half of it. And I claimed some of the things that I knew better. She claimed some of the things that she knew better. And then we wrote it out. And then we shared the documents with each other, broke it into chapters, and we edited each thing we wrote to make it sound not like one or the other. So even if she wrote something that was really good or I wrote something that was really good, we would chop words into it and chop sentence structures into it to where if you're reading the book, you can't really tell if I
Sure.
wrote it or if she wrote it because it's meant to be one cohesive voice.
Right. No, that's
Mm-hmm.
interesting. That's
Mm-hmm. And we did it entirely remotely. We did it on the phone, on the computer. We would have like times where we would just log on and work in the Google Doc without being on the phone. Then we would have times when we were on the phone. We would edit on the phone. We would read the book out loud on the phone and edit as we went. When we got to the very end of it, we printed everything out, every single chapter, and did red pen edits on paper and then called each other and we went through each chapter with the red pen edits. It was intense. It was
sure.
very, very, very intense.
And just like, how long would you say that process took, like overall?
It took us from this, like when we started writing the book, it took us about 3 years to publish it. And that includes all of the reporting, the fact checking, the information gathering, the editing, all of it took about 3 years. The actual editing process, once we got to the end, like the final edits process, probably 5 or 6 months where we were just going through the Google Docs, just constantly chopping stuff and constantly doing stuff in red pen and going back and forth. There was probably 5 or 6 months there where we just went back and forth.
And I'm just kind of curious from like the editing perspective.
Yeah.
Would you say you cut like more technical content out or more story based?
Honestly, the only stuff we really found ourselves cutting, because we had a lot of freedom with it, the only stuff we really found ourselves cutting was the stuff we couldn't fully corroborate. And there was a lot of interesting stuff in the book that we could not publish because either people had NDAs or like
Sure.
stuff we knew to be true, but we didn't have the final documentation for. That was unfortunate having to cut
Sure.
that part. But really, I mean, we were able to talk about the history of Formula One, talk about the technology on the cars and everything like that, because ultimately, this book is a business story that happens within a sport. So I have to tell you what the sport is and what happens
Sure.
in the sport and the history of the sport. But it's a standalone story to where, like, if you're watching a documentary about some sports scandal, you don't have to be a fan of that sport to watch it because the people presenting the documentary will tell you all the stuff you need to know. That was basically what we did.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't read it.
It's
So
okay.
I'm very
No one
pressed for
ever
time.
has to read it.
No, sure. I mean, it was interesting when I went through and looked at it. I was like, I mean, it's just, I think, an interesting take of how you would follow something like kind of that unique, right? This
Yeah.
this team that just starts up and then kind of
Mhm.
goes forward, if you will. But I guess I'm just kind of curious from like a technology standpoint, and just in general, with the way the automotive industry is kind of going and shifting is a major paradigm shift here. And when I look at like what happens, here in the production side of things, and just when you see like major advances in technology, I feel like outside of like public sector or private sector financing of something to research it, a war, unfortunately, or, those push technology, leaps and bounds forward, then you have racing, and that's like, well, in all honesty, right? It's a huge capital undertaking to get some of these teams going and moving forward. And I'm just kind of curious how you basically, whether for the research of the book and just you're following the sport in general, where you see like racing going with respect to the technology in the future, I guess like in the immediate future, and then farther from there.
It's a very interesting question because you could argue that quite a few forms of motorsports are pretty technologically obsolete. In
Mhm.
NASCAR, they ran a 4-speed H-pattern
Sure.
manual up until last year. And that to me is hilarious. The only other vehicle on sale in America with a 4-speed at that time was a 4-speed automatic in the Dodge Journey. Like
Sure.
that was it. And that was technology from the 1980s. It was it was completely obsolete. The transmission, and I mean, they use pushrod V8s. Sure, pushrod V8s are super cool and have a long history, but they're not the future, right? That's not what's
Right.
carrying us forward. And so I find that a lot of motorsports, you can test certain things in a
Sure.
racing environment. And also you have series like Formula E, which do
Right.
test newer technology like electric cars. But a lot of these existing motorsports like NASCAR, Formula One, IndyCar, stuff like that, it's really a lot of entertainment. And I think one driver named Parker Kligerman, I think he made this point once that made me more understand where we could probably see motorsport going.
Mm.
He said people used to ride horses
Sure.
and they raced horses. People don't really ride horses as a commute
Sure.
anymore, but they still race horses. So Parker's take on that was basically, sure, cars and cars that don't drive themselves and cars that are powered by gas may become obsolete, but will the entertainment they provide us become obsolete? That is something that we will answer in the future.
Sure. Sure. And even with like some of the, the advances, like,
Mhm.
Jordan had a Model 3 Performance. And I think one of the crying shames of it is it could drive itself because you wouldn't want to, in all honesty. It's a fun car to drive. I mean, there's aspects, like the EVs kind of feel a little soulless, at times, with respect to, your more traditional vehicles, especially if you really push the boundary and have like, manual steering, manual brakes, things of that nature. But, you have to their soul might be there. It might be a little quieter. You have to listen to them a little bit more. But when I look at that, it's kind of a shame it drives itself because I don't really
Mhm.
want it to, it's nice, I
Mhm.
guess, if you were tired, but it's interesting. And I would agree that, more than likely we'll still see that. Like there's your racetracks, you have all those things, and arguably the impact that I would say motorsports has, even from like an emissions perspective, as fuels change and stuff like that, is probably relatively low in compared to like heavy industry and things of that nature.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
but I mean, I don't want to divert too early with respect to that, but do you see like what is like the conversation happening in motorsports with respect to like maybe maintaining some of these more conventional forms longer, and maybe with alternative fuels or hybrids or things of that nature?
A lot of the things I see aren't necessarily about the cars themselves
Hmm.
yet. So there has been some talk in NASCAR about some sort of hybridization of the car. I don't know how soon that would happen. It would also be very, very mild hybrid. It
Sure.
is not going to be like an actual hardcore hybrid. It would be very mild. But I think a lot of racing series right now are less focusing on their products and their cars that they race and more focusing on some form of carbon neutrality. Like, when we put out this many emissions, we're going to try to get those emissions back and we're going to lower our footprint. You see this happen with Formula One has talked about carbon neutrality, things like that, but also on a smaller scale with series like Extreme E. Extreme E is an electric SUV racing series, and they go race in the remote parts of the world, basically, the parts of the world that are affected by climate change. Instead of flying to these places, they take everything on a boat.
Sure.
There are conversations about this, but I feel like those conversations are often less about the cars themselves and more about how people get places,
Sure.
which is a very fair approach because I don't remember it super well, but I feel like Formula One did an emissions report pretty recently where they talked about where their most of their waste and emissions
Sure.
came from. And I think most of it was travel to the tracks, not actually what happens on track.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because
Hmm.
it's always a nuanced conversation. There's a lot of
Hmm.
layers to any of this. From like we like to try and do like total accounted costs for various things here, but when you look at like the total roll up of everything, you're talking for us in the costing world, it's from depending on how detailed we're going, but like raw material all the way up, so to speak, and there's burden and layers of cost as you kind of go through these stages. And it's interesting because whether it's like some of our like competitors or just people that do other type of costing services, the scope of what they look at, right, is very different at times.
Yeah.
And then there's always a question, at least on our end, like, I'd like to understand a little bit more about how you got that number, and you're like, fair
Hmm.
enough,
Hmm.
and then we walk through some of the aspects of that with them, and they're like, okay, and based off your assumptions, I can see why you've arrived at the the cost that you have. So
Hmm.
um it's just interesting. I don't follow it closely, on Sundays with my daughter, I'll watch like Australian vintage car racing, which is out of control. I don't know if you watch it, but
Love that.
it's the commentation's amazing, and it's just interesting to see these cars that are worth a bit of money, and are classics in their own right, just bending fenders and slamming into corners and crashing on some of the most technical tracks in the world, like Bathurst and stuff like that. So
Classic car racing always terrifies me because I look at those cars and I'm like, oh, I watched some of those cars race and you just bend one of them.
yeah.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, obviously they fix them. You look and you'll
Yeah.
see some of the same drivers, year after year, and same '69 Boss Mustang, same. Probably
Mhm.
been rebuilt 3 or 4 times. Fortunately for some of those cars, they make a lot of reproduction parts, and you can essentially stitch them back together almost indefinitely, realistically. Maybe some of the older, like Dodge products, and maybe even some like your older AMC stuff. That's what's actually wild to see, is when you see like some
Mhm.
Javelins and other cars like that, like being fixed and wrist, I would say, being wrist.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
now, do you race like now? I know you started kind of in motorsports. Do you?
I do track days. I
Okay,
have done a couple of races myself, but often my days are just so full of
sure,
actually doing my day job, and my day job is often reviewing cars, writing about them, and writing about motorsports events and interviewing people and things like that. And so it is hard to fit that in. I try to do a few track days a year just so I can drive and I feel like it is helpful to have an understanding of the racetracks you watch people drive and also of how to drive the cars yourself. Like it allows you to have conversations with racing drivers where you more understand what they're talking about and you're able to carry that conversation better. So I definitely do try to do that. I don't race as much as I would like to. I
hmm
would love to race more. It's just, you get done with the work week and you're like,
sure,
I need a nap.
right, yeah. No, I feel you for sure. And honestly, it's expensive.
Yes,
Like
very.
depending the weight and stuff like that of the car. It's the
Mhm.
reason Miatas are popular, right? So there's a couple of us
Mhm.
that rock them here, but
Mhm.
some other cars you can kind of go through 2 or 3 sets of front tires. When I one time went into the shop to get tires, and they're like, "This is the 3rd time we put front tires on your Mustang." I'm like, You're like, "You're still in the original sets of rears." I'm like, "Yep." It's a heavy car, so it gets beat up in the
Ugh.
turns. But
Yeah, we have a sim rig at home, but mainly my husband uses it. I find that with the sim rig, because he uses iRacing, and we have a
mhm,
very nice sim rig. We have a triple monitor, racing
sure,
seat, direct drive wheel. It's a very, very good sim rig. I find that I'm okay with using it on ovals and driving ovals, but I don't necessarily like the sim rig on road courses. And I think I figured this out. I think it's because I have enough experience on the racetrack on road courses to where I'm looking for the feel in my seat, but not enough experience where if I'm a racing driver, I'm looking for my marks and not relying on my feel. So I rely on my feel because, when I'm on track, that's what I rely on. But I don't have enough experience to look for those marks and be able to be really technical about it. So I just find that when I do road courses on the sim rig, I get very, very thrown off. I can take turn 1 at Circuit of the Americas incredibly well in a real car. On iRacing, I miss it every time.
sure,
I can't do it. It's just so deeply confusing for me because I'm looking for something that's not there.
yeah. I mean, I could definitely see that for sure.
Mhm.
I don't have a ton of experience. I've done, a host of track days. We got Waterford, which is very close to
Mhm.
me, which is a nice small technical track. Um, and then Groton, which is very pretty if you've ever been out that way. But yeah, I mean, I play Forza and stuff like that. But that's pretty much where I do a lot of it right now.
Mhm.
With my daughter, I'll kind of sit her down. We'll try and steer. Doesn't go well, but we'll get there eventually. But
I love that.
yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'm waiting. I think Forza Horizon or Forza 8 comes out soon, so we'll see. But it's I guess it's kind of a nice bridge. But like it's interesting. We'll hop on. We'll drive around with Forza Horizon, so she can just drive around and see what's kind of up. And I think I don't know if it was the last update, but there was like a whole donut media thing,
Yep.
right? Like, and I'm like, oh
Mhm.
my god, this is it's kind of wild to see that, something that started like small, relatively speaking, right? Just a couple of guys going through some stuff. And then you have essentially not only like a brand, there's whole subsegments within this brand. And then now it is, made it into like the digital space beyond, right? And it's kind of wild. Like high car, low car is now in Forza, right? So you're like, all
It's so
right,
cool.
this is interesting. I can't drift to save my life, so I've kind of stopped in that story path aspect of the drifting. I'm like, well, we'll just do something else for now. But
Yeah.
so it's, I mean, I kind of have to ask, like, what is it kind of like with working for Donut with essentially like I would say an organization now that has so many like multifacets that's still so young, if that makes sense.
Yeah, they reached out a couple of years ago and they said, "Hey, we want to do an F1 podcast. Do you and your co-author Elizabeth want to be on it?" And we were like, "Yeah, let's do it." And so we went out there, we recorded our first episode. We had a great time, and now we record every single week at home. They bought me this microphone and they bought me the nice little pop filters so you can't hear my breath on the microphone. And we do a weekly podcast about Formula One, and it's super fun. And we get to go out to the studio a couple of times a year. So we get to go meet everybody, participate in some YouTube videos, do
Sure.
stuff like that. It's really cool to be folded into something that is already so big and so
Sure.
successful. And I think what's cool about Donut is Donut has a huge audience and a huge grasp on car culture right now. And Donut is able to use that grasp on car culture to bring people like me and Elizabeth in and go, hey, look at these women who know a lot about
Sure.
racing and are very, very knowledgeable and have written a book. Look at them. They belong here. And I
Yeah.
think that is something that you've had in doses throughout the years in the car industry. Like Elizabeth and I both worked at Jalopnik. We had women at Jalopnik. We had women at other car blogs and stuff like that. But it is really nice to be in visual and audio format in front of so many people who have, paid attention to the car industry for a long time, because it's even things as little as my voice has a different tone than your voice. So maybe if I write something, somebody can go, oh, yeah, like this woman's a good writer. But listening to my voice is different because I don't have a low male tone voice. And so to be able to put me and Elizabeth and people like that in front of people to get them used to hearing women talk about cars and used to seeing women talk about cars is very, very cool. And I feel like really helps feed the next generation of car people, because a lot of the people who listen to our podcast and watch Donut have young kids. And there will be people who reach out because we have an email address for our podcast. We get tons of people who reach out and say, my daughter listens to the show, and my daughter is a little kid and she thinks it's so cool that women get to talk about Formula One, because it's a kind of medium where people of all ages can really consume it and think it's cool. Writing is kind of something you get into as you get older, because I can write a story and a kid is not gonna fully follow it, or they're not gonna know it's a woman or whatever. It's a very tangible way to say, hey, look, women can do cool things in the automotive industry and you can too. And isn't this great? And I think that's a really special thing. We hear so much from people who listen to the show who are like, I think it's so cool that y'all are on there. My daughter thinks it's so cool that y'all are on there. I even had one person, like after our book published, send me and Elizabeth a photo of their child in the back seat, young daughter. She was maybe 8 years old, reading our book about Formula One. And that's crazy to
Sure.
me. That's wild. That's so cool that kids get to read these books and listen to these shows and watch these YouTube episodes with women in them
Sure.
and get to go, wow, yay, I can do that too.
And do you feel like, because you kind of brought up an interesting point with respect to like, Donut's like reach on car culture and things of that nature. There's a lot of talk, obviously, about like overall like production volumes going down. Like I follow like kind of the pony car segment very, very closely of anything. And you look, I want to say, I'm trying to think what last year's production volume was. But I want to say it was like, let's say 55,000 units for the Mustang,
Mhm.
where like in 1966 it was like 1,000,002. And in general, while some aspects of brands are expanding and various other ones are contracting, and there's a lot of talk about just in general for various reasons, whether it's just the cost of vehicles and other like economic conditions, just and even maybe just even when cities are laid out, less desire for like private ownership of vehicles. But do you feel like the like the car culture, I would say like from the tuners, hot rods, things of that nature, just in general, will shrink, or do you think it'll, from what you've seen now, maybe in some ways continue to grow because it's opening to whole new segments of both the world and just people in general?
I think even if those segments shrink, it's okay
Hmm.
because time moves on, life changes. We have different ways we rely on traveling. We have different things we do, right? We go from gas powered cars to electric cars. We go from manuals to automatics. We have things change over time, and enthusiasm and what enthusiasm looks like changes. And I think there will still be tuner cultures. There will still be a lot of those things, and they will exist. Will they exist in a smaller way? Maybe. Will they exist in a bigger way? Maybe, because maybe we rely less on cars, and maybe we rely less on gas powered cars to just get us places, and they become more fun. I think a big argument that a lot of people in the automotive industry make, including myself, is when we rely so much on cars for our day to day, it can take the fun out of them, right? And if you have to drive to work, or you have to drive on a commute somewhere, or you have to do something behind a car, that's not the car enthusiasm you like. That's just not you. Car enthusiasm often comes on a racetrack or on some fun roads and stuff like that. I think a lot of people don't go, I'm about to drive 4 hours on the highway and I am so excited, because I'm about to do that and I am not so excited. Do I love cars? Yes. Do I love driving them on the highway for 4 hours straight? No.
Mm,
And so these things can evolve. And also, I feel like car enthusiasm can evolve to maybe people aren't around cars as much. Maybe people are in cities and they have public transit and things like that, but they still enjoy cars and they still enjoy motorsports and things like that. It doesn't have to be your everyday living and breathing for you to like it. It doesn't have to be something you particularly care about too much.
sure.
I wrote a story recently about how vintage NASCAR fashion is super in right now. Like, that is one of the fashion trends right now. And you'll see people everywhere who are wearing vintage NASCAR shirts and jackets and things like that. They don't know who's on the jacket. They don't know whose jacket it is. And that's okay. I talked to one person, they're a musician. Their name is Flash. Very good musician. I listened to all of their music and I was like, wow, okay, I'm a fan. I'm going to listen to all this for a long time. Interviewed Flash for this ESPN story about NASCAR fashion. And they were like, yeah, I just like the way it looks. I don't know whose jacket it is. I don't know what it is. But the more I wear it and the more connected I get to it, the more I'm like, I kind of want to go see a NASCAR race. And Flash said they tried to go to a NASCAR race for their birthday last year, but ended up like their friend group got COVID or something like that. So they ended up not going. But these little slivers of enthusiasm can turn into big enthusiasm, and I think that's really cool. And I think the more car culture and the enjoyment of cars and motorsports is just weaved into everyday society, whether or not people know a lot about
Sure.
it, is helpful, and it's cool, and it's very vibrant and interesting. And someone doesn't have to be able to name the past 20 sprint cups, not sprint cup, it's not the sprint cup, it hasn't been that for a long time, the past 20 NASCAR Cup Series champions. They don't have to be able to name those people to be able to be like, yeah, I like this jacket and I'm going to wear it. It's cool. There are different levels of everything, and I think even as society changes and these cultures change, they'll still be very interesting and very cool to be a part of.
So just for my own edification, does NASCAR fashion stop at like a race team jacket, or is there more to it than that?
No,
So
there's a lot to it. I mean, People wear the jackets, people wear the vintage shirts, people try to find really weird vintage shirts, and I see people on planes, I see people everywhere wearing these vintage shirts. And the thing is, back in the day, there was a lot of creative license with NASCAR apparel. These days, a lot of the apparel is templated. So if I buy, I don't know if this is templated or not. This is a Tyler Reddick shirt. I think it's templated, but this shirt, if it is templated, has Tyler Reddick's name on it, but change a couple of the colors and we'll put Kyle Larson's name on it
Sure.
and sell it to the next person, right? Back in the day, there was personalized design and styling, and it was so cool. And there is a lot of that today. I mean, I've talked to a lot of the designers today. Ryan Williams is a designer for Junior Motorsports, which is an Xfinity Series team. Very good designer, incredible shirts. I bought some the other day. I talked to Harris Liu and Emily Butler. They're also designers. They are so good, and they focus on that vintage fashion style, right? And I buy a lot of their stuff because it's interesting, it's different, it's not templated. I the other day bought a vintage Bill Elliott jacket that had a picture of Bill Elliott's face on the front of the jacket, and I thought it was hilarious, so I bought it. It's just these things are like interesting and weird,
Sure.
and it's not templated, and people like when things feel unique and
Right.
they feel like their own thing and they feel like people put effort into them, not just switching a couple of the colors.
No, I think that's an interesting point. And I mean, the reason I asked the question, if you think
Mhm.
it'll expand, I mean, I don't have like a great, finger currently, on that pulse. Maybe in a couple of years, or maybe when I get back out to like the Woodward scene and stuff like that,
Mhm.
and really kind of see what's out there. It's been a few years, but I almost like I always felt that like when you saw some of these like either ultra high efficient vehicles and things like that being built, that those were enablers for all the fun cars, right? And a lot of people are like, oh, I
Mhm.
can't believe this is happening or that. I'm like, well, aside from like cafe standards and things like that, like there's a balance to all this. You have to have vehicles that have profit centers, that to keep things kind of afloat. There's vehicles that are sold, at a loss for various reasons, oftentimes for like emissions compliance and things of that nature. And then, but some of these things like pay the bills, right, for these other vehicles. And I don't know. That's as much as I'm like kind of worried as like a an automotive enthusiast. I kind of feel like if anything, we'll see maybe a swing in some ways the opposite way. Even if you're not driving a car every day, in some ways that frees up time or money to work on something that you like, that you're passionate about. Um,
I feel like people are very focused on doomsday and very focused on, oh my goodness, automakers make so many SUVs. My counter to that is the Mazda Miata still exists.
sure.
Like in its original form, in the 50-50 weight balance, 2,400-pound vehicle with a manual transmission. That thing still exists. The Lexus LC500, they don't sell any of those. Nobody buys that car. That car still exists and it's really, really good. The Cadillac, the V cars, they've had
Mm,
so many names, but now they're at the CT4 and CT5V Blackwing. In what world does a CT5V Blackwing or a CT4V Blackwing exist for the mass market?
sure.
They're literally catering to us. And
Right.
you could say, oh my goodness, we're losing all the good cars. No, you're lucky you still have these cars. Like, they're not big sellers and you're still getting them. And that is so cool to me.
Well, I think when when you mentioned the guilty pleasure of the LC 500, I wasn't sure if I was going to bring it up,
Oh,
but because there's
love
not
that
many of
car.
them, there's not.
Oh,
But for a customer, I did a slow teardown of one, so we
oh,
slowly and systematically tore it apart. And
oh.
it's a very nice car. I mean,
Yeah.
fortunately, it was. I mean, or depending on how you look at it was the hybrid version.
Hmm.
It wasn't the
Hmm.
V8 with the manual.
Hmm.
But it was an interesting car. That particular customer was interested from a lot of styling aspects, from stamping feasibility. They liked and it's funny because without going into too much details, they kind of champion some of that Coke bottle shape, in some of these
Hmm.
cars. But they were
Hmm.
just looking at some of the dramatic styling aspects of the LC 500 as essentially a more attainable version of it, like the LFA. And
Hmm.
it's interesting. Very small weld flanges in some areas. I want to say, like, if I remember off the top of my head, the trunk is like 9 millimeters, which is
Yeah, I
crazy,
tried to
right?
close it on myself and I could not get in there. No.
Um, so yeah, it's a cool car, heavy. very heavy. I'm surprised because there's,
Very heavy car.
a
And
lot
you
of
can get the
aluminum in it,
optional
but
carbon fiber. You can get the carbon fiber on the roof, and you can get the carbon fiber everywhere, and I'm like, "Who does this help?"
the roof doesn't help. Like,
This car is gonna be so heavy regardless, it doesn't matter.
yeah. And, if even in steel, right, you're probably talking about something that's like 0.8, maybe
Mhm.
millimeters thick on top, probably even thinner than that for the roof. And then it just costs money to put composites on the roof, right? I mean, it saves some weight, but not really. It looks cool. It's almost cooler to have a continuous look from like a composite hood, carbon all the way through, or whatever you wanted to
Mhm.
do. It is a very cool car. And I remember we were going through it, and like the taillights specifically have that depth of draw. They go into infinity, right? And the they're like, please don't show this to the product design guys because they're going to ask us to package this thing, and it's an absolute nightmare. And the first thing they
Mhm.
came down like, where are the taillights? And they're like, they're over there. But it was interesting. It was a cool car. I had saw that you were quite fond of it, and I want to say there's 5,000 of them that they made, like at least that one year. I don't know if they're even in production still anymore. I just know they
I
don't build
have
a
the
lot of them.
stat I have the stat somewhere. They are still in production, and I
Okay,
think the stat is they sell about 1,200 a year.
that
Um,
doesn't surprise me.
yeah, don't quote me on that, but I think that's the stat. I think, like, a couple of years ago, they sold 1,219 or something. Ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous sales numbers. I would buy that thing in a heartbeat. It's
Sure,
so cool. But I mean, it doesn't check my boxes as someone with a two-car garage because it is a grand tourer,
sure,
and I'm gonna have a practical car and a sports car, not
right.
combined. But it works for a lot of people because that is such a cool car, and it looks like a spaceship. I love it.
Yeah, and I mean, I like the automotive industry has ruined me. Like there was things I just don't
Mhm.
even think about, before, 10, 15 years ago, but when I get in a car now, I'm like, someone gets a new car, I look at all the gaps, I'm pulling on things. I'm like, ooh, it
Always.
squeaks. And that's one thing I would argue just over the last 10 years, cars have gotten so good. Like in general, like they have
Yeah, they
problems.
are.
There's lots of recalls. COVID was a hard time to build cars. Frankly, the fact that cars even get made in general is amazing. When you look at like the feat of engineering, logistics, and just everything behind them. But I will say that like the LC 500 is like very well built on the inside. Like the grab handles, those are all like cast magnesium and wrapped. You grab them and you just
Mhm.
pull, and it makes no noise. And same
Mhm.
thing with the interior, despite the fact that the interior panels are literally just like all Phillips head screws. And you're like, oh, like for us, it's a nightmare. If I would have showed it to
Mhm.
Sandy, he probably would have like instantly died, with how many bolts were in it. But I get it. It may not be worth the tooling to do heat staking for all that. Because if
Mhm.
you look at the
Mhm.
production line, it's like white coats and it's like surgery, and
Yes.
so it's pretty impressive to see like where they're built and how they're built. A lot of gingerly love assembling them. So yeah, I wasn't sure if I was going to mention it because I knew it had like a special place in your heart, and we slowly and systematically like dismantled it.
That would be rough for me. That
Yeah.
would be a rough thing for me to see.
Yeah, and after they like tested the body for modal testing, then we started cutting up like pieces of it to see what
Oh.
all the layering, like one whole side of it just peeled off, and
Oh.
just to see how it was built, and
Oof.
so yeah, it hurt a lot of the guys that were real into JDM stuff when they came down, and they were like, this isn't right. They did not build a
No.
lot of these cars.
No,
We
don't do
shouldn't be
this.
doing this.
No, put it back. Put it back, please. I'm begging you. Yeah, because they really do. There are not a lot of those cars.
No,
And I think the most interesting thing is, I think Doug mentioned this when I talked about the LC 500 on Doug DeMuro's channel. He was like, even cooler is going to be the LC 500 without the trackpad, because Lexus's trackpad existed for a long time. And as much as automakers want to sell trackpads, people feel iffy about trackpads, and
sure.
there will be very few LC 500s without trackpads.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting, right? Like with the Model 3 Highland, no stalks, and I was like, oh, I like everything about it besides. I
Mm-hmm.
get it. I mean, but I can do the shifter on the center console. That's fine. No
Mm-hmm.
problem with the Model S. It's a little
Mm-hmm.
weird, but you just got to get used to it. I'm not sure I can get used to the no stock thing. It's interesting to see some of these human to machine interface decisions that are being made, and I'm all for change. And when you look at like just where things are going in general, there's in general less buttons, a lot of interfaces are, touchscreen and simplified and, just kind of layers to them. And there's a lot to be said, like for us, we were advocating for some of that stuff for years. When you would look at like some of the bill of material costs for stuff, like old timey vehicles at this point, but it'd be like engine, transmission, body, Harman Kardon stereo. It's like the fifth line item for how much money was in this thing. And you're like,
Yeah.
do we really pay this much for this? And they're like, every bit of that. And they want more money next year,
Yeah.
And, that was one of the things we were advocating, like, oh, everyone has these cell phones, right? So can we not like leverage some of that stuff and get some of that content just in a screen that is an interface and whatnot? But it's interesting seeing how various OEMs have reacted to the Tesla tablet, and its presence, which seems to be like overwhelming, in some ways, right?
I drove a Sequoia the other day that had a tablet the size of my laptop. I have a 13-inch MacBook.
Yeah.
And I held up the MacBook to the tablet, and it was the same size.
It might have been a
as
MacBook.
The Mac. It honestly might have been a MacBook. I liked it. It was very crisp. It was very easy to see. It was a great screen. It was just the size of my MacBook.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think that's, I don't want to say unfortunate. I think it's definitely a trend and a facet that will stay. The screen sizes have only gotten sharper, better, 4K. I mean, we just saw the BMW i7, and I mean, not for me, but if I had that kind of money, I didn't know what to do with, maybe, it was definitely an experience to drive around in, and more specifically be driven in,
Yes.
It's very nice. And everything about the kind of like the drive modes and the and how that kind of corresponds with like the visual cues and all the screens is kind of impressive. I thought it was, again, it's not my cup of tea. I'd rather have like an E90 M3, but
fair.
I did think it was cool. It was a neat vehicle, but
I think you can appreciate both.
No, for sure. And kind of to your original point of like the kind of the cars going away, I would argue this is like peak. Besides like the 60s, like late 60s, very, very early 70s, this is almost like peak time for cars. I mean, and I, coming from like kind of working on cars when I was younger and building various things, and then now coming into the car industry, like I don't want to say I don't like aftermarket stuff. I just very leery when you look at like how much stuff, when you see like, oh, I'm just gonna like swap these control arms to these big box steel things, that could be bad in a crash, or do you really think this person is like, are these weld certified? They just don't fly apart later or something like that. So it's changed I've always been an OE plus as far as aesthetics for cars. And I'm definitely now like an OE plus for car modifications, as far as that aspect. But I don't know. I think it's like when you just look at the plethora of vehicles that are just out there, I think it's arguably like the highest point of cars that have kind of ever existed.
You also have things like the Ford Bronco. With Ford actually, when the Bronco debuted a bunch of Ford aftermarket parts. Like they were aftermarket parts, but they were Bronco parts. So if you wanted to customize it, you didn't have to, one, wait for the aftermarket, or two, be like, oh, I guess I should do some research on this. They were all parts that were made to be part of that car. Yeah,
I mean, that was an interesting launch of a vehicle. It was tough for them, like with the supplier issues and all that stuff. But it's funny when like Scott Hoffman was getting his master's, he was doing a presentation. So we built this thing about the new Bronco because there was rumors about it and stuff like that, and like what it would be. And one of the big things I said is like, in his presentation, they were like, advocating, you don't steal your competitor's flagpole. You don't go after that aspect, right? So the Jeep is slow speed, technical off-roading. And then, you kind of look at like Ford's like off-roading heritage. It's always been speed, and it's always been, kind of that aspect. Even the Bronco, when it was solid axle and essentially just like a stamped box. But there's pretty much no way they would ever put a solid axle in it. It doesn't make any sense from like the platform that it was being built off of, from a cost perspective, and just what you get from like a ride and drive perspective. And it was one of the things, and it's almost like guaranteed now. Like I drive around and I see more Broncos than I see Wranglers. And we kind of joked about it. I was like, I think when you look at the volume, you're going to see a ton of women switch over to it. I have a lot of respect for women that drive Jeeps because it's like, as far as like ride driving, it's a terrible vehicle. Like it's just the worst, you know. I like them. They're awesome. Eventually I'll get one. But I knew that like when you would see this kind of like this shift, because it doesn't necessarily drive well on the street, and you may not be able, you may not be using the full off-road capability where you really want to disconnect the sway bars and have the rigidity of that. And I would argue the Bronco gives you like probably an 80% solution to most off-road obstacles anyway, and can drive through many off-road things significantly faster than a Jeep ever could, and then drives on the road significantly better. And you're seeing like this kind of whole migration to people who are switching Broncos, you know. And that's one thing that I've noticed is like, I think it's going to do really, really well with like the female demographic, because I think it's a better vehicle for that in some ways, because at least in our area, people want like that adventure vehicle, but they don't necessarily need that like nth degree of the solid axle. And they've already kind of switched. It's kind of been interesting for me to see like how it's come back, where it went, and the problems it's had, but yet the successes that it's had as well. So
I think you also have to consider, like, in the public eye and in the public connotation, Jeeps have been around forever. Like a Wrangler is just a Wrangler, right? Like you see them, and to a normal person, a new Wrangler doesn't look particularly new. Like it looks the same as it's always looked. So to a normal person, you see a Bronco, which hasn't been on the market in what, 25 years or something like that. You see a Bronco and you're like, "Oh, that's way different. That's interesting." And so it's that, but it's also just like it's something different. It looks new. I can talk about it being new. And honestly, the Bronco looks great. I think it looks really cool. I think people look adventurous, you know, without having that Jeep connotation, like, oh, I'm just a Jeep person, you know. If you're thinking about the general public wants to look adventurous and interesting, but they want to look like that in a different way. And I think the Bronco also gives them that.
Yeah, I mean, aesthetically, the only thing I don't really like about it is the round wheel wells. You know, I get why they did it. Ford trucks have round wheel wells, and you know, it's kind of like off that platform and that philosophy. But they kind of fixed up with the Heritage Edition. You can kind of get the boxed out fender flares. But
Fair.
Yeah, I don't know. It's been, at least around me, it's been an interesting case study in the kind of greater Detroit metro area to see the transition of vehicles over, where you'd see households that would have both, right? And they had a Wrangler for a long time, and then, you know, someone got a Bronco, and then they were both there for a little while, and then the Wrangler went away, you know, and I'm like, interesting, you know, because it is like a staple. Like, you know, I'm from Pennsylvania originally, and we don't call them like off-roading trails. You just call them Jeep trails, you know. Here in Michigan, a lot of two tracks is kind of what they talk with some of that stuff. But it just kind of, you know, throughout the world, there's whole vehicle segments that are just referred to, or vehicle types. They're like, that's a Jeep. It's not, you know, but they just call them Jeeps, you know. That's just how permanent, you know, in automotive like history it is. I think besides like Jeep, Mustang, Corvette, pickup truck, that's like the most American vehicles like on the planet, like the demographics. You're so right. So, and if you don't like them, you could argue in every way that you're like un-American. Like, oh, you don't like the Mustang? Oh, all right. You know, you don't like a Jeep? All right. You know.
No, fair. Totally fair.
Won a world war, you know. So, you know, it's pretty interesting. So, I know we kind of went on like a tangent with the. We started with the LC500. I
love tangents.
Yeah. So
I love tangents. Don't worry.
I did kind of want to like ask a similar question that I asked about like the racing aspect for technology. So, you know, we don't do obviously like a lot of supercar stuff or anything like that here, but like, what do you think from that perspective? Like, that's kind of in my mind very similar to racing, where you have these halo vehicles, and I mean like legitimate halo vehicles where they're pushing the boundaries. If there is an existing architecture, they're tearing it up. You know, I think like the Mustang GTD like falls that territory, right?
Yes.
Just big tear up, Multimatics building it, things of that nature. But like some of these, like, you know, supercar hybrids and things of that nature, you know, that's not something we do here. We try to get money out of vehicles, not put money into vehicles. But I'm just kind of curious on your take on that.
You know, I find that in order to drive a lot of cars to their potential, like a lot of cars to their potential, you have to be on a racetrack.
Sure.
You can't do it on the road. This is particularly true with supercars. I mean, you take a Lamborghini Urus out, the SUV, you take it out on a road, it's fine. It's completely unfazed. It literally could not care less, right? It doesn't matter it doesn't matter how good the road is. Like, if you drive it well and also you're not getting arrested for driving it, right? You can't put it out of sorts. There's nothing you can do to challenge this car. And so I find that to properly evaluate cars like that, if you're going to review them or give your opinions on how they drive, you have to be on a racetrack. And you just often don't get that, unfortunately. You're often driving these cars on the road. And so, like, I can tell you what it's like to drive them on the road, but I can't tell you what it's like to drive them at any sort of limit, whether it's my limit or their limit. And often it's going to be my limit, not their limit, because very few people can reach those cars' limits. They're just good. The cars are so good. I drove the Rimac Nevera in October or something like that. The Rimac Nevera is a 2,000 horsepower electric supercar, for those who don't know.
Sure.
What a flex.
What a car, right? Oh my goodness. You can't, in the time you start to move your foot on the pedal,
Sure.
it's already going 70 miles an hour.
Right.
Your foot physically can't hit the floor fast enough to legally floor that car on the road. It's the most absurd thing I've ever seen. But also, you're driving this car. It was raining when I drove this car, and I was like, "Do you want me to, like, be careful, like, not floor it?" And they said, "No, floor it. It doesn't matter."
Sure.
Like,
yeah.
it will correct any little issue you may have. And I think that's very, very cool. These cars are so good. These cars are better drivers than us, right? Also, there is the other side of that, which is these cars are better drivers than us, so we can forget how big of a deal driving is. You can forget how consequential it is to drive a car. I mean, if you get in a new car on a highway, it's so nice and so wonderful. I drove an Audi Q8 e-tron the other day on the highway. I was going 80 and it felt like I was going 45. And you can forget, like, I'm doing a big action here. Like, this is dangerous what I'm doing. It's easy to forget when the cars are good drivers.
So, not to beat this topic, like, so you said, like, you couldn't get them. You don't see their full potential, right?
No,
like
never.
But on the
Not-
road, so do you feel like with some of these, like, performance EVs and, let's say, performance hybrids, do they lose anything in street driving, or do you think they just become better?
I don't know that they lose anything, but I do think, and this is a thing I've said about the Kia EV6. So you
Okay.
take a normal Kia EV6. I haven't driven a normal Kia EV6, but an EV6 GT is so fast it will break your neck. But ultimately, it's a party trick. And with EVs especially, you pay less for better range or more for worse range but more power, right? So you pay less to get better range. So the EV6 is cheaper. The EV6 GT is more expensive and has less range. And ultimately, a car's acceleration, whatever, that's a party trick. You show people that one time, two times, whenever. You show people that for the first time and then it's over, right? And so if you're buying a car to own, you have to consider, what are my priorities? Are my priorities to have fun all the time, or are my priorities to have a party trick? Me, am I going to pick a party trick vehicle over a Mazda Miata? Probably not, because if I'm on the road, if budget matters, if the money matters, I would rather have a vehicle I enjoy all the time than a vehicle that's a party trick.
So, this is Eric Munro, producer, chiming in. What is your daily driver then?
We have a 2004 Mazda Speed Miata and another 2004 Mazda Speed Miata. And then we also have a 2012 Hyundai Elantra. And we were going to buy a different car before the pandemic because that was my high school car. We were going to buy a different car before the pandemic. And then all the car prices shot up. And we were like, you know what? AC blows cold in here. We can't say that for the two Miatas.
Sure.
So we're going to keep this guy. It holds luggage. It has AC. We're good. So,
Right.
like me, I'm about to drive 4 hours to Dallas. I'm taking the Elantra. My husband took one of the Miatas to work.
Right. That's awesome. I have a very crappy NA Miata, but I wish I liked MBs. There's so many better ones
They're
out
so
there, especially
cute.
up here. They're like little Vipers.
Yeah.
But if it doesn't have pop-ups, it's not for me. So for now, I'll
Very
probably get
fair.
another one at some point, but they're so expensive. They're coming
Very
down,
fair.
but
hmm
that's kind of. But it's funny. I think we've talked about it or joked about it. There's I think 3 people have Miatas here, and 2 of the 3 are like 6'3" and over 215 pounds. So like when people see us get out of them, they're like, or if we drive somewhere
people
together,
who drive
you know.
Miatas are the
So-
people who can't fit in them.
Yes.
No one who can fit in a Miata drives a Miata.
But I'm highly selective about whether or not I like Miata people or not. They seem to irritate me, or I appreciate them. You know, I'll see some that are slammed, or you'll see constantly on the line like, I crashed another one. I'm like, bro, this is why they're so expensive. You know,
Yeah, stop crashing them.
stop. You know, invest in tires, not Chinese coilovers, and learn to drive and stop crashing these cars. They're not making any more NA Miatas
Totally
or
agree.
NBs. You know, it's kind of a shame to see. In general, I want to say thank you very much. I really appreciate the time you took to talk with us, and it was a great time. Love doing it. Do it again if you ever want to. It's
Absolutely.
it's interesting to
Thanks for
see
having
different
me.
sides of that. Of the car world, right? And we have
Mhm.
a weird niche in it, and then there's the other side of like receiving cars and getting to like evaluate them from that perspective. So
Definitely. Yeah.
So yeah, no, thanks again. Again, I can't thank you enough. It was a lot of fun. So maybe till next
Absolutely.
time,
Thank
and
you.
we'll go from there.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks. Take care.